September 3, 1945. Camp Sendai No. 1, Miyagi Prefecture, Japan. The morning air carried the smell of burnt rice and disinfectant through the open windows of what had been a Japanese military barracks 48 hours earlier. Sunlight filtered through the paper screens, casting geometric shadows across the wooden floor where 37 former Imperial Japanese Army soldiers sat in rigid seiza position. Knees folded beneath them, backs straight despite exhaustion, hands resting on thighs in the formal posture they had maintained since childhood. Most wore tattered remnants of their khaki uniform shirts with missing buttons, trousers held up with rope, some barefoot because their boots had disintegrated months earlier. Their faces remained expressionless, masks of disciplined acceptance, even as their eyes betrayed confusion and fear. They had surrendered 6 days after Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast announcing Japan's capitulation. Emerging from mountain caves on Honshu where they had prepared for a final suicidal defense that never came, they expected execution, or at minimum brutal treatment that would justify the propaganda they had absorbed for years about American savagery. Instead, American soldiers of the 11th Airborne Division had processed them with bureaucratic efficiency fingerprints, photographs, medical examinations, delousing, hot showers. Now, at 08:07 hours on this September morning, a U.S. Army quartermaster sergeant named Robert Chun walked into the barracks accompanied by 2 privates carrying wooden crates. Chun was 31 years old, born in San Francisco to Chinese immigrant parents, fluent in Mandarin and conversational in Japanese acquired during military intelligence training. He set the crates down with a hollow thud that made several prisoners flinch. Then he did something that violated every expectation these Japanese soldiers carried about captivity and defeat. He opened the crates to reveal stacks of civilian clothing, cotton shirts in various colors, canvas work pants, simple shoes, and in carefully practiced Japanese. He announced, "You may choose what you wish to wear. Take your time. Select what fits." For perhaps 10 seconds, no one moved. The concept was incomprehensible. Prisoners did not choose. Defeated soldiers had no agency. Then the first man stood a former corporal named Takeshi 23 years old, who had not worn civilian clothes since his conscription in 1943. He approached the crate slowly, touched a blue cotton shirt with trembling fingers, looked at Sergeant Chun for confirmation that this was not a trick or a test, and when Chun nodded encouragement, Nakamura lifted the shirt from the crate and held it against his chest to check the size. And then, without warning, without permission, without the iron discipline that had governed his every action for 3 years of military service, Takeshi Nakamura began to cry. Not quietly, not with stoic Japanese restraint, but with great heaving sobs that shook his shoulders and bent him double. The blue shirt clutched to his chest as tears fell onto the cotton fabric, darkening it with wet spots that spread like ink on paper. The story of Japanese prisoners crying over the simple act of choosing their own clothes begins not in a surrender camp in 1945, but in the elaborate system of military and social control that had governed Japanese society since the early 1930s. The transformation of Japan from a constitutional monarchy with nascent democratic institutions into a militaristic totalitarian state happened gradually, then suddenly, as military factions gained control over government, education, media, and daily life. By 1937, when Japan launched full-scale war against China, Japanese society had been thoroughly militarized. Conscription was universal for males, and military values permeated civilian life hierarchy. Obedience, self-sacrifice, subordination of individual will to collective purpose. The concept of personal choice, particularly regarding something as trivial as clothing, was increasingly viewed as Western decadence incompatible with Japanese spirit. Soldiers wore uniforms. Civilians wore approved styles that reflected their class and occupation. Children wore school uniforms. Women wore increasingly simplified clothing that eliminated frivolous decoration and emphasized practicality and modesty. Even color choices carried ideological weight. Bright colors suggested insufficient seriousness about the national emergency. Wardrobe earth tones demonstrated proper austerity and commitment to sacrifice. By 1944, as American submarines severed Japan's supply lines and strategic bombing destroyed Japanese cities, most Japanese civilians owned only 1 or 2 sets of clothing, often patched and repatched until the fabric could no longer hold together. The idea of selecting clothes based on personal preference rather than availability or regulation was a luxury most Japanese had not experienced in years. For soldiers, the erasure of individual choice was even more complete. From the moment of induction, every aspect of life was regulated: when to wake, what to eat, how to stand, when to speak, how to think. Uniforms were identical, worn identically, maintained identically. Personal effects were minimal and standardized. The military system was designed to break individual identity and rebuild soldiers as interchangeable components of the imperial war machine. And it worked, forging units that would fight to near total annihilation rather than surrender. That would charge machine gun nests with bayonets when ammunition ran out. That would embrace death with ritualized acceptance because individual survival was subordinate to collective mission. The emotional contrast between what Japanese prisoners expected and what they experienced in American custody was so extreme that many simply could not process it psychologically. Lieutenant Hiroshi Sato, a platoon commander captured on Okinawa in June 1945, kept a diary that was later translated and preserved in U.S. military archives. His entry from his first day in American captivity reads, "We were marched to the prison compound expecting to be machine gunned at any moment. This is what we were taught, that Americans take no prisoners, that they torture and mutilate Japanese soldiers before killing them. I prepared myself for death, reciting final prayers to the emperor and my ancestors. Instead, we were given food, not scraps or garbage, but actual military rations: canned meat, crackers, fruit. The quantities were astonishing. More food in one meal than I had eaten in a week during our last stand. I was so certain this was a trick, a final cruelty before execution, that I did not eat for 2 days, expecting the food to be poisoned. But others ate and did not die. On the 3rd day, I ate. The food was real. We were not executed. This made no sense. Every certainty I possessed was false. If Americans do not murder prisoners, what else is untrue? The question is more terrible than any torture could be." Sato's diary captures the profound cognitive dissonance experienced by Japanese prisoners confronting the gap between propaganda and reality. They had been taught that Americans were racist barbarians who viewed Japanese as subhuman vermin to be exterminated. They had heard stories, many fabricated, some based on real atrocities by individual American soldiers acting outside policy of captured Japanese being tortured, mutilated, or murdered. The propaganda was pervasive and consistent. Surrender meant death preceded by unspeakable suffering. Therefore, honorable soldiers fought to the death or committed suicide. The few who surrendered did so believing they had forfeited their lives, their honor, and any claim to decent treatment. When actual American military policy proved dramatically different, when prisoners received food, medical care, shelter, and humane treatment, the contradiction was psychologically destabilizing. Everything they believed was false. If this was false, what else? The historical evidence of American treatment of Japanese prisoners is extensively documented in military records, Red Cross reports, photographs, and post-war testimony from both captors and captives. American policy toward Japanese POWs was governed by the Geneva Convention, which the US had ratified despite Japan's refusal to do so. The policy mandated humane treatment, adequate food and medical care, protection from violence, and respect for cultural and religious practices insofar as they did not conflict with security requirements. The US military had practical reasons for maintaining these standards beyond humanitarian concerns: intelligence value of cooperative prisoners, propaganda value of humane treatment that might encourage further surrenders, and commitment to maintaining moral high ground in a war often characterized by racial hatred and brutal violence. But the policy was also shaped by American cultural values emphasizing individual dignity, legal procedures, and democratic principles that distinguish between enemy soldiers and enemy governments. American military culture, for all its racism and violence, maintained institutional boundaries on acceptable treatment of prisoners. Individual violations occurred. Japanese prisoners were sometimes murdered by American soldiers seeking revenge or operating under battlefield stress, but these were violations of policy, not policy itself. The contrast with Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners was stark and deliberate. Japanese military culture explicitly rejected Western concepts of prisoner rights, viewing capture as dishonorable and prisoners as unworthy of humane treatment. The death rate for Allied prisoners in Japanese custody was approximately 27%, compared to 4% for German and Italian prisoners in American custody. The difference reflected fundamental cultural divergence in how the two militaries conceived honor, humanity, and the laws of war. The transformation of Japanese prisoners' understanding began with small observations that contradicted their indoctrination. At Camp Sendai, former Private First Class Kenji Yoshida noticed that American guards rotated shifts regularly, worked 8-hour days, had time off, received mail from home, and generally operated under a system that treated them as human beings with needs and rights rather than as expendable components of a military machine. This was radically different from the Japanese military system, where soldiers were expected to endure any hardship without complaint, where expressing personal needs was considered weakness, and where the boundary between dedication and abuse was not merely blurred but deliberately eliminated as part of military culture. Yoshida observed American soldiers complaining about duty assignments, joking with each other, questioning orders from superiors in ways that would have resulted in severe punishment in the Imperial Army. He watched American officers consulting with enlisted men about logistical problems, incorporating their suggestions, treating them as collaborators rather than subordinates. These observations accumulated into a revelation. American military effectiveness was not achieved despite treating soldiers as individuals with agency, but because of it. Soldiers who felt valued fought harder, contributed ideas, took initiative. The rigid hierarchy of the Japanese system, which Yoshida had been taught was superior because it eliminated selfish individualism, was actually less effective than the more flexible American approach that balanced hierarchy with recognition of individual worth. This realization was profound and disturbing. If Japanese military culture was not superior, what had they been fighting for? What made their sacrifices meaningful? The questions multiplied with each observation that contradicted indoctrination. The symbolic object that came to represent American abundance and unexpected humanity was not sophisticated technology or weapons, but the simple act of choice itself, the offering of options where none were expected, the recognition of individual preference in a context where individuality had been systematically suppressed. When Sergeant Chun opened those crates and told Japanese prisoners they could choose their clothing, he was not following a specific protocol or implementing a deliberate psychological operation. He was acting on routine American assumptions about individual agency that were so deeply embedded in American culture that he did not recognize them as ideologically significant. In American civilian life, choosing one's clothes was ordinary, unremarkable, barely conscious. In American military life, even where uniforms were standardized, personal choice existed in dozens of small ways: how to arrange personal effects, what to write in letters home, how to spend free time, what to believe. American military culture imposed hierarchy and discipline, but preserved a core concept of the soldier as an individual citizen temporarily in service, rather than as the property of the state. This distinction seemed subtle, but its psychological effects were profound. For Japanese prisoners who had not made a personal choice about anything in years, what to wear, what to eat, when to sleep, where to go, the sudden restoration of agency over something as trivial as shirt color was overwhelming. It was not the shirt that mattered. It was the recognition implicit in being allowed to choose. You are a person, not a number, not a defeated enemy, not an object to be processed, but a human being with preferences that matter. This recognition, coming from captors who were supposed to be subhuman monsters, shattered the psychological foundations that had sustained these men through years of militaristic conditioning. Corporal Takeshi, who had been the first to approach the clothing crates and the first to break down in tears, was interviewed decades later by Japanese researchers documenting prisoner experiences. His account provides insight into the psychological impact. I had not cried since basic training when I was beaten for showing emotion during a punishment drill. The army taught us that crying was weakness, that Japanese soldiers endured all hardship with stoic acceptance. I had internalized this completely. Even when my brother was killed on Guadalcanal, even when I watched my friends die from starvation and disease, I did not cry. I had become what the military wanted: a man without personal feelings, a weapon to be used and discarded. But when the American sergeant told me I could choose my clothes, not which uniform to wear, but actually choose based on what I preferred, something broke inside me. It was as if I suddenly remembered I had been a person once, before the military, before the war. I had been a boy who liked blue because it reminded me of the sky, who had opinions about things, who made small choices that reflected my preferences. The military had erased all that, and I had accepted the erasure as necessary for the war effort. But in that moment, holding that blue shirt, I remembered who I had been. and I mourned for the boy who had been destroyed to create the soldier. And I cried for all the years of having no choice about anything. And I cried because the enemy was treating me with more humanity than my own officers ever had. The Americans gave us choices. The Japanese military had given us only orders and death. This realization was shattering. The historical records showed that the clothing distribution incident was not unique to Camp Sendai, but occurred in multiple POW facilities across the Pacific as American forces processed tens of thousands of Japanese prisoners in the war's final months and immediate aftermath. The pattern was consistent. Prisoners were allowed to exchange military uniforms for civilian clothing, and many experienced emotional breakdowns during this transition. American military personnel observing these reactions were often puzzled, noting in reports that prisoners became distraught when offered clothing choices or showed extreme emotional response to routine supply distribution. The Americans could not understand why something so mundane would provoke such reactions because they could not comprehend the extent to which individual agency had been stripped from Japanese soldiers. From an American perspective, choosing clothes was trivial. From the Japanese prisoners' perspective, it was the first autonomous decision they had made in years, and it represented the possibility of reclaiming a selfhood that military service had obliterated. The emotional release was not about the clothes themselves, but about what the choice represented: the recognition that they were individuals who could have preferences, whose preferences mattered, who were not simply interchangeable components of a defeated military machine. Lieutenant Hiroshi Sato's diary, which continued through his months in American custody, documents the gradual psychological transformation that followed initial experiences that contradicted propaganda. His September 15, 1945 entry reads, "Today, we were given forms to fill out with personal information: name, hometown, family members, occupation before military service, hobbies." Hobbies. The form asked about hobbies as if we were human beings who did things for personal enjoyment, rather than soldiers who existed only to serve the emperor. I sat with the pencil for 30 minutes trying to remember what I had enjoyed before conscription. I was 20 when inducted in 1942. Before that, I studied literature at university. I liked reading novels, Soseki, Murray, even some Western literature in translation. I liked hiking in the mountains near my home. These memories seemed to belong to someone else. Another person who had existed before the military transformed me into something else. The American form presumed that person still existed, that underneath the soldier was a human being with individual characteristics worth documenting. This presumption was more subversive than any propaganda could be. The Japanese military had taught us that we were soldiers first and only soldiers, that our individual selves were obstacles to be overcome. The Americans treated us as if our individual selves were real and important. Which view is correct? The question haunts me constantly. If the Americans are right, then everything I believed about sacrifice and duty was wrong. But if the Japanese view is right, why did we lose? Why are the Americans, who supposedly weaken their soldiers by treating them as individuals, standing victorious, while we, who achieved perfect military discipline by destroying individuality, stand defeated? The documented statistics provide context for individual experiences. Between August 15, 1945, Japan's surrender, and December 31, 1945, American forces processed approximately 3.5 million Japanese military personnel in Japan itself, plus hundreds of thousands more scattered across former Japanese-controlled territories from Manchuria to the South Pacific. The vast majority were not formally POWs but demobilized soldiers returning to civilian life under American occupation authority. However, several 100,000 were processed through formal POW facilities before release, particularly those captured before the surrender or those suspected of war crimes. American military planners, anticipating massive prisoner flows, had developed detailed protocols for processing, housing, feeding, and eventually releasing Japanese prisoners. These protocols emphasized efficiency, but also included provisions for humane treatment, cultural sensitivity, and eventual reintegration into civilian life. The clothing distribution was part of a deliberate program to facilitate psychological transition from military to civilian identity. American authorities recognized that Japanese soldiers strongly identified with their uniforms and that forcing them to remove military insignia while keeping military style clothing would be humiliating and counterproductive. The solution was to provide civilian alternatives and allow prisoners to choose whether and when to make the transition. This approach reflected American pragmatism and democratic values, offering choice rather than imposing diktat, recognizing individual psychological needs, and understanding that successful occupation required winning cooperation of the defeated population rather than simply imposing control through force. The transformation occurring in Japanese prisoners' minds was not merely personal but ideological. The American approach to prisoner management implicitly communicated democratic values, individual worth, personal agency, rule of law, humane treatment, regardless of enemy status. These values contradicted the totalitarian ideology that had governed Japanese military and civilian life for over a decade. For prisoners whose entire adult identity had been shaped by militaristic indoctrination, exposure to functioning democratic values was psychologically destabilizing, but also potentially transformative. Former Sergeant Masao Tanaka, who spent 6 months in American custody before release, described the experience in a 1952 interview. "I entered the prison camp as a defeated soldier who had failed the emperor and deserved death. I left as a man who began to question everything I had been taught. The Americans did not lecture us about democracy or try to convert us to their ideology through propaganda. Instead, they simply treated us according to democratic principles, giving us choices, respecting our dignity, following legal procedures, allowing us to voice complaints through established channels. This was more persuasive than any propaganda could be. I saw American democracy in action at the level of daily prisoner management, and I saw that it worked. The camp was orderly, but not oppressive. Rules existed, but included mechanisms for appealing decisions. Guards had authority, but also constraints on how they could exercise it. Prisoners had obligations, but also rights. This system was foreign to everything I knew, but I could not deny that it functioned effectively. More than that, I could not deny that being treated according to these principles felt better than anything I had experienced in the Japanese military. When I was released and returned to my village, I was a different person than the man who had gone to war. I had seen an alternative to the totalitarian system that had governed my life, and I could not unsee it. This was the beginning of my transformation into someone who would support democratic reforms during the occupation. The symbolic weight of the clothing choice moment extended beyond the immediate experience to represent a broader pattern in how democratic and totalitarian systems treated human beings. In totalitarian systems, individual choice was systematically eliminated as part of molding populations into uniform masses easily controlled by central authority. Choices about clothing, food, education, employment, marriage, residence all were regulated, restricted, or eliminated entirely. The system was efficient in some ways, eliminating waste and friction associated with individual preference. But it was also brittle, breeding resentment, crushing initiative, and creating populations that complied outwardly while resisting inwardly. In democratic systems, individual choice was preserved even when it created inefficiency, because choice itself was recognized as essential to human dignity, and because systems that respected individual agency ultimately proved more resilient and adaptable than those that suppressed it. The clothing crates at Camp Sendai represented this fundamental difference in miniature. The American approach of choices, respect preferences, recognize individuality was less efficient than simply distributing standardized items without input, but it was more humane, more psychologically sound, and ultimately more effective at achieving the goal of transforming defeated soldiers into peaceful citizens who would accept occupation authority because they experienced it as legitimate rather than merely powerful. Private Kenji Yoshida, who had observed American guards operating under systems that recognized their individuality, was assigned to work detail in the camp kitchen, and there encountered another dimension of American abundance that contradicted Japanese wartime experience. The camp kitchen received regular supply deliveries: meat, vegetables, rice, canned goods, flour, sugar, coffee, butter. The quantities astonished him. American military rations provided approximately 4,000 calories per day per soldier, with additional supplies allocated for prisoners at slightly lower, but still adequate levels. Japanese soldiers in the final year of the war had subsisted on progressively shrinking rations that averaged 800–1,500 calories per day, often supplemented by foraging when possible. Yoshida had experienced genuine starvation, had watched comrades die from malnutrition and vitamin deficiency diseases, He had participated in debates among starving soldiers about whether it was more honorable to die from hunger while maintaining discipline or to break discipline and steal food to survive. The American camp kitchen, with its regular abundant supplies, its food waste that would have fed an entire Japanese company, its casual assumption that adequate nutrition was a baseline requirement rather than an unattainable luxury, communicated industrial and agricultural capabilities that Japanese propaganda had consistently denied. Yoshida wrote in a letter to his family after release, "We were told America was weak, dependent on luxury, unable to endure hardship. We were told Japanese spirit would overcome American materialism. But American materialism meant their soldiers ate well while ours starved. It meant their supply lines functioned while ours collapsed. It meant they could feed their prisoners adequately while we could barely feed our own troops. Material abundance is not weakness when it enables you to sustain military operations indefinitely while your enemy disintegrates from malnutrition. We lost not because we lacked spirit, but because we lacked food, fuel, ammunition, medicine, all the material things our propaganda taught us to despise as Western decadence. I learned in that prison camp kitchen that spirit without resources is just slow death." The epilogue to the clothing distribution story extends beyond individual prisoner experiences into the broader transformation of Japanese society during the American occupation. 1945-1952. The occupation was remarkably successful compared to most military occupations in history, transforming Japan from militaristic empire to democratic ally in less than a decade. Multiple factors contributed to this success: Emperor Hirohito's cooperation, Japanese cultural adaptability, American economic aid, Cold War pressures that aligned American and Japanese interests against Soviet expansion. But one often overlooked factor was the psychological preparation that occurred in prisoner camps where hundreds of thousands of Japanese military personnel had their first sustained exposure to American values through the medium of humane treatment rather than propaganda. These former soldiers returned to their communities with direct experience that contradicted militaristic ideology. They had expected brutality and received decency. They had expected deprivation and received abundance. They had expected to be treated as subhuman enemies and instead were offered choices, respected as individuals, and eventually released to rebuild their lives. This experience created receptivity to American-led reforms that might otherwise have faced more resistance. When occupation authorities introduced democratic reforms, land redistribution, labor rights, women's suffrage, educational reform, constitutional revision, significant portions of the population were open to these changes, partly because their prior experience with American authority had been surprisingly benign. The clothing crates at Camp Sendai were minor logistical items in vast occupation operations, but they represented in microcosm the approach that made the occupation successful: recognize individual dignity, offer choices rather than impose decisions by fiat, demonstrate abundance rather than just military superiority, show that democratic values produce better outcomes than totalitarian ones. Takeshi Nakamura, who had broken down crying while holding a blue shirt, returned to his village in Shikoku and became a schoolteacher. He taught for 32 years, retiring in 1977. In a 1989 interview conducted for a Japanese television documentary on the occupation period, the elderly Nakamura reflected that young people today who have only known democratic Japan cannot understand what it was like to live under the old system, where every aspect of life was controlled, where individual choice was viewed as selfish, where the nail that stood up was hammered down. They take for granted the ability to choose their education, their career, their spouse, their political representatives, their clothes. They think this is natural. But it is not natural, it is precious, and it was purchased with the defeat of the militaristic system that had ruled Japan. When I tell my former students about crying when an American soldier let me choose a shirt, they think I am being overly dramatic. How could something so trivial provoke such emotion? But it was not trivial. It was the moment I began to reclaim my humanity from the military machine that had consumed it. It was the moment I understood that the enemy propaganda had been lies, that Americans were not monsters, and that a different kind of society was possible, one where individual choice was normal rather than subversive. That moment in the prison camp, holding a blue shirt and crying uncontrollably, was the beginning of my transformation from an imperial soldier into a democratic citizen. I spent my career teaching children to think independently, to question authority, to make informed choices, to value their individuality. These values seem obviously good now, but they would have been considered dangerous, even treasonous, under the system I grew up in. The shirt was just a shirt, but the choice was revolutionary. The historical significance of how America treated Japanese prisoners extends beyond the immediate post-war period into the Cold War era, when Japan became America's most important Asian ally. The bilateral relationship that developed was built partially on strategic considerations and economic complementarity, but it was also built on Japanese popular attitudes toward America that were shaped by occupation experiences. The fact that millions of Japanese had direct or indirect experience with American authority through the occupation, and that the vast majority of those experiences were relatively benign or even positive, created foundation for alliance that might not have been possible if American forces had governed with the brutality that Japanese militaristic propaganda had predicted. Japanese who expected Americans to be racist barbarians instead encountered a system that, while flawed and sometimes marked by prejudice, nevertheless operated under legal and ethical constraints that produced generally humane outcomes. This gap between expectation and reality dramatized in moments like prisoners crying when offered choice of clothing created psychological openness to accepting American leadership in the post-war order. The democratic reforms introduced during occupation took root, not just because they were imposed by a victorious power, but because significant portions of Japanese society had experienced American democratic values in action and found them appealing compared to the totalitarian system that had led Japan to catastrophic defeat. The symbolic power of the clothing choice moment was recognized by American military psychologists studying prisoner behavior. Reports from multiple facilities noted that simple acts of recognizing prisoner agency, allowing choices, soliciting opinions, treating prisoners as individuals rather than uniform enemy mass produced dramatic improvements in cooperation, morale, and successful transition to civilian life. One report from November 1945 observed, Japanese prisoners respond with apparent gratitude and emotional release when given opportunities to exercise personal choice in minor matters such as clothing selection, work assignments, or recreational activities. This response seems disproportionate to the triviality of the choices offered, suggesting that prisoner experience of agency has been severely constrained not just by captivity, but by prior military service in a system that systematically eliminated individual autonomy. Recommendations: continue policies that offer choices where operationally feasible. The psychological benefits exceed the minor administrative costs, and the policy serves broader strategic objective of demonstrating democratic values through practice rather than propaganda. The report's recommendations were incorporated into occupation policy more broadly, shaping American approach to governing defeated Japan in ways that emphasized encouraging voluntary cooperation rather than simply imposing control through military force. This approach was not purely altruistic. American authorities calculated that willing cooperation would be more stable and less costly than coerced compliance. But the calculation was correct, and the approach succeeded in ways that pure military occupation might not have. The clothing crates were small elements in large strategy, but they represented strategic wisdom of recognizing that hearts and minds are won not through force or propaganda, but through consistent demonstration of values that resonate with fundamental human needs for dignity, agency, and individual recognition. The tear shed by Japanese prisoners when offered choice of clothing represented the collapse of psychological walls built through years of totalitarian conditioning. The military system had taught them to suppress individual desires, to find meaning only in collective service, to view personal preferences as weakness. This conditioning was enforced through brutal discipline, peer pressure, ideological indoctrination, and the ever-present threat of punishment for deviation. It worked, producing soldiers who would fight to death rather than surrender, who would charge futilely against overwhelming firepower rather than retreat, who would endure starvation and disease without complaint because complaining was betrayal of the collective. But the conditioning was also fragile, dependent on maintaining total control over information and experience. Once prisoners encountered alternative systems that contradicted their indoctrination, once they experienced being treated as individuals whose choices mattered, the conditioning began to fracture. The tears were symptoms of this fracturing, the return of suppressed emotions, the resurgence of individual identity that military service had tried to erase, the overwhelming relief of being recognized as human beings with agency rather than as enemy objects to be processed. Some prisoners adapted to this psychological transition relatively smoothly, quickly reclaiming civilian identities they had suppressed during military service. Others struggled with identity confusion, uncertain who they were if not soldiers serving the emperor. A few never adjusted, remaining psychologically trapped in militaristic mindset, even as the system that had created it was dismantled around them. But the majority, given time and consistent humane treatment, eventually accepted that the old system was gone and that adaptation to democratic values was possible and even desirable. Lieutenant Hiroshi Sato's diary, which he maintained for years after his release, provides one of the most detailed accounts of this psychological transformation. His entry from May 3, 1946, Constitution Memorial Day when Japan's new democratic constitution took effect, reflects on his journey. The new constitution guarantees rights I did not know I possessed until I became a prisoner of war. Freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, the right to due process, the right to be treated with dignity. These were not rights in the old system, they were Western corruptions that weakened national unity. But I have lived under both systems now. I experienced the totalitarian system that controlled every aspect of life and ended in catastrophic defeat. I have experienced, even as a prisoner, the democratic system that recognized my individuality and allowed me to make choices. I know which system treats human beings better. I know which system is more likely to produce peace and prosperity. The military system demanded everything from us: our youth, our health, our individuality, our lives, and gave us only defeat, destruction, and death in return. The democratic system, even when encountered through prison camps and occupation, offered dignity, choice, and hope for the future. I cannot return to the old way of thinking. I cannot pretend that militaristic ideology was noble rather than destructive. I can only move forward as a citizen of democratic Japan, teaching my children the values I learned from unlikely teachers, the American captors who gave me choices when I expected only death, who treated me with humanity when I expected brutality, who showed me through their actions rather than their words that another way of organizing society was possible. The shirt I chose in that prison camp hangs in my closet still. It is worn now, faded, no longer fits properly, but I keep it as a reminder of the moment I began to reclaim my humanity from the system that had tried to destroy it. That shirt is more precious to me than any military medal could ever be, because it represents not what I gave to the collective, but what the collective had taken from me, and what I finally got back, 75 years after the end of World War II. The story of Japanese prisoners crying when allowed to choose their clothes survives as historical footnote in the vast literature on the war and its aftermath. It is not a story of dramatic battles or famous generals or turning points that change military outcomes. It is a story about something simultaneously smaller and larger, about how totalitarian systems dehumanize individuals and how democratic systems recognize humanity, about the psychological impact of having agency restored after years of having it suppressed, about the power of simple human decency to penetrate ideological conditioning and create openings for transformation. The clothing crates at Camp Sendai were mundane items, routinely distributed as part of administrative procedure for processing prisoners and facilitating their transition to civilian life. But in the hands of men who had not made a personal choice in years, who had been taught that individual preference was selfish weakness, who expected death and received instead recognition of their humanity. Those simple choices became revolutionary acts. The revolution was internal and individual rather than political and collective, but it was no less real for that. Each prisoner who chose a shirt or pants based on personal preference was performing a small act of reclaiming selfhood from the totalitarian system that had tried to erase it. Each act of choice was a rejection of the militaristic values that had governed Japanese society, and a tentative acceptance that alternative values were possible. Multiplied across hundreds of thousands of prisoners having similar experiences, these individual transformations accumulated into cultural shift that helped make possible Japan's post-war democratization. The tears shed over blue shirts and canvas pants were tears of lost mourning for years stolen by militaristic system, for comrades dead in service of false ideology, for families destroyed by war that should never have been fought. But they were also tears of relief, gratitude at surviving when death seemed certain, amazement at receiving humanity from expected enemies, tentative hope that a different future was possible. The American soldiers who distributed clothing could not see inside the prisoners' minds or understand the full significance of what they were doing. They saw administrative procedure and prisoners responding with disproportionate emotion they could not fully comprehend. But the significance was real regardless of awareness. In that moment, democratic values triumphed over totalitarian ideology, not through military force or political proclamation, but through simple recognition that even defeated enemies were human beings whose individual choices mattered. This recognition, repeated in countless small interactions between victors and vanquished during occupation years, built foundation for alliance that has lasted generations and for Japanese democracy that has proven resilient and enduring. The clothing crates are long gone, distributed and worn and discarded decades ago. The prisoners who cried have mostly passed away, their stories preserved only in scattered interviews and archives. But the moment they shared, the moment when choice was restored and humanity was recognized, endures as testament that even in its aftermath, even between bitter enemies, even across vast cultural divides, fundamental human needs for dignity and agency can be recognized and honored. And when they are, transformation becomes possible. This is the larger truth embedded in the story of Japanese prisoners crying over clothing choices. That freedom is not merely political structure or legal framework, but the lived experience of having agency over one's own life, even in small matters, and that systems which recognize and honor that agency ultimately prevail over systems that suppress it, because human beings will always choose, when given the chance, to be treated as individuals who matter rather than as interchangeable components of machines that devour them. The shirt Takeshi Nakamura chose was blue, the color of sky and hope and possibility. He chose it because he liked it, for no strategic or practical reason, just personal preference. That choice, and the tears it provoked, contained more revolutionary potential than armies or ideologies, because it represented the irreducible human truth that totalitarianism can never fully suppress. Individuals matter, choices matter, and given the opportunity, people will choose freedom over slavery, dignity over submission, hope over despair. The American soldier who offered that choice changed the world in ways he never knew and never imagined, simply by recognizing the humanity of defeated enemies and allowing them, in the smallest way, to reclaim the selfhood that war had tried to destroy.